Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that beneath the ancient bedrock of the Canadian Shield lies a discovery worth $473 billion that has triggered the most desperate scramble for resource access in American history? And what if I told you that this discovery, confirmed by Canadian researchers just 4 months ago and classified until 2 weeks ago, contains materials so critical to national security and technological supremacy that the Pentagon has quietly redesignated Canada as an indispensable strategic asset whose cooperation is essential for American economic survival? This is not how resource dependencies reveal themselves in the modern era. The discovery was made by accident during routine geological surveys for infrastructure development in northern Saskatchewan. Core samples extracted from depths of 2.5 kilometers revealed something that material scientists had theorized but never observed in nature: naturally occurring graphene formations and carbon nanostructures of unprecedented purity and scale, preserved in crystalline matrices that have remained stable for millions of years. The initial findings seemed too extraordinary to be accurate. Natural graphene exists nowhere else on Earth in extractable quantities. Carbon nanotubes, graphene sheets, and fullerene compounds represent the foundation materials for every advanced technology system that will define the 21st century, from quantum computers to fusion reactors to space-based manufacturing. 6 independent confirmations later, Canada had secured control over the world's only commercially viable source of advanced carbon materials essential for technological civilization's next phase of development. I have studied the classified reports from the Canadian Geological Survey, the emergency assessments conducted by American intelligence agencies, and the desperate diplomatic initiatives that followed confirmation of the Saskatchewan discovery. What I discovered is the most strategically important resource find in modern history and the most spectacular collapse of American resource security planning since the rare earth crisis of 2010. The world thinks this is about mining rights and export agreements. They are measuring the wrong transformation. The Saskatchewan formations contain an estimated 200 million tons of naturally occurring graphene, 150 million tons of carbon nanotube precursors, and 50 million tons of fullerene compounds distributed across underground deposits covering 25,000 square kilometers of northern Saskatchewan wilderness. The materials exist at concentrations and purity levels that make laboratory-produced alternatives economically obsolete. These carbon materials represent the foundation components for quantum computing systems, advanced semiconductor manufacturing, next-generation energy storage, space-based construction, and military technologies that currently exist only as experimental prototypes. The nation that controls these materials controls the technological infrastructure that will determine economic and military supremacy for the next century. The extraction process, while complex, utilizes modified mining techniques that Canadian companies have already successfully tested at pilot facilities. The carbon materials can be harvested using controlled thermal extraction that preserves their molecular structures while enabling industrial-scale production. Canadian facilities can produce these advanced materials at costs 95% lower than synthetic alternatives, while achieving purity levels impossible through artificial manufacturing. The economic implications are staggering beyond conventional measurement. Current global production of synthetic graphene costs approximately $200,000 per kilogram and can supply only research applications. Canadian natural graphene can be produced at $50 per kilogram while maintaining superior quality and unlimited scale. The cost reduction makes previously theoretical technologies commercially viable overnight. American technology companies realized the magnitude of their strategic disaster within days of the Canadian announcement. Intel, IBM, Google, and Microsoft had invested over $500 billion in quantum computing research over the past decade. Every advanced quantum system depends on carbon materials that Canada now controls exclusively. The cascade effects accelerated with terrifying speed for American technology leadership. Advanced semiconductor manufacturing requires carbon nanotubes for next-generation processors that are 1,000% more efficient than current silicon-based systems. Canadian control of nanotube supplies means American chip manufacturers face the choice between accepting technological obsolescence or becoming dependent on Canadian materials for their most advanced products. Energy storage transformation followed immediately as American companies recognized that carbon-based supercapacitors and battery systems using Canadian materials could store 50 times more energy than lithium-ion alternatives while charging in seconds rather than hours. Tesla, General Motors, and Ford began emergency negotiations for guaranteed Canadian carbon material supplies. The military implications were the most alarming for Pentagon planners. Advanced carbon materials enable lightweight armor that is 10 times stronger than steel, electromagnetic pulse shielding that protects critical systems from enemy attack, and hypersonic vehicle construction that makes traditional missile defense systems obsolete. American defense contractors discovered that every next-generation weapon system in development depends on carbon materials that Canada now controls. Lockheed Martin's hypersonic missile program, Boeing's space-based platforms, and Raytheon's directed energy weapons all require Canadian carbon materials for operational deployment. The American response revealed the depth of strategic panic that the Canadian discovery had created. Within 72 hours of confirmation, according to early indicators from Pentagon sources, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin convened emergency sessions with Canadian officials to discuss resource access agreements under national security frameworks. The discussions reportedly included offers of advanced military technology sharing, joint defense manufacturing partnerships, and security guarantees that had never been extended to foreign resource suppliers. American officials recognized that their military modernization programs faced immediate termination without Canadian cooperation. The desperation escalated when American negotiators offered to share classified stealth technology, advanced radar systems, and satellite surveillance capabilities that had been restricted from all foreign partners, including closest NATO allies. The Pentagon's willingness to compromise national security protocols demonstrated the existential nature of American dependence on Canadian carbon materials. American intelligence agencies reportedly began unprecedented cooperation initiatives with Canadian counterparts, offering shared intelligence access, joint operations capabilities, and security partnerships that exceeded anything provided to traditional allies. The CIA and NSA were authorized to establish permanent liaison offices in Saskatchewan specifically to facilitate carbon material security arrangements. The Federal Reserve took extraordinary measures to ensure Canadian carbon material suppliers had unlimited access to American financial markets and currency exchange systems. Emergency protocols typically reserved for wartime economic mobilization were implemented to prevent any financial constraints from disrupting Canadian carbon material development. Congress received classified briefings that reportedly led to bipartisan support for legislative measures guaranteeing Canadian companies preferential treatment in American markets, tax exemptions that exceeded domestic company benefits, and regulatory frameworks designed specifically to accommodate Canadian carbon material operations. The State Department simultaneously launched diplomatic initiatives offering unprecedented trade concessions, technology transfers, and economic partnerships in exchange for guaranteed access to Canadian carbon materials. Secretary of State Antony Blinken personally contacted Canadian counterparts to establish resource supply agreements that would prevent American technological development from becoming hostage to Canadian policy decisions. The most revealing indicator of American desperation came from the Treasury Department's emergency authorization of the Defense Production Act to expedite partnerships with Canadian carbon material suppliers. The DPA, traditionally used to direct American industrial capacity toward military priorities, was expanded to include foreign companies operating under foreign jurisdiction to ensure American access to materials considered essential for national security. Chinese officials began parallel negotiations with even more aggressive offers. Beijing proposed comprehensive technology sharing agreements, massive infrastructure investments, and preferential trade terms that exceeded anything China had offered to resource suppliers. Chinese leadership understood that access to Canadian carbon materials could enable them to leapfrog American technological capabilities while consolidating control over advanced manufacturing. The Chinese Communist Party's Politburo reportedly authorized the sharing of previously classified quantum communication technology, advanced artificial intelligence systems, and hypersonic propulsion research that had been restricted from all foreign partners. The decision represented the most significant technology transfer authorization in Chinese history and demonstrated Beijing's recognition that carbon material access was essential for maintaining technological competitiveness against American innovation. Chinese state-owned enterprises received emergency authorization to offer Canadian carbon material companies ownership stakes in Chinese manufacturing facilities, guaranteed market access for Canadian technology products, and joint venture arrangements that would provide Canadian companies with controlling interests in Chinese industrial operations. These offers violated fundamental principles of Chinese economic sovereignty that had been maintained since the establishment of the People's Republic. The People's Bank of China established specialized currency exchange mechanisms designed to facilitate Canadian carbon material transactions while bypassing traditional international financial systems that could be disrupted by American economic pressure. The mechanisms represented the most significant modification of Chinese monetary policy since the yuan's initial internationalization programs. Chinese military leadership authorized the sharing of advanced missile technology, satellite systems, and electronic warfare capabilities with Canadian defense companies in exchange for guaranteed carbon material access for Chinese military modernization programs. The technology transfers exceeded anything China had previously offered to strategic partners and demonstrated the military implications of carbon material dependence. European Union representatives initiated their own diplomatic offensive, offering Canadian companies access to European markets, research partnerships, and regulatory frameworks that would facilitate global distribution of Canadian carbon materials. The EU recognized that carbon material access would determine which regions could maintain technological competitiveness in post-silicon electronics and quantum computing. The competitive bidding for Canadian carbon material access revealed how completely the discovery had transformed international technology relationships. Instead of Canada seeking partnerships with technology leaders, the world's most advanced economies were competing for Canadian cooperation on terms that Canada would determine. Canadian strategic planners approached these negotiations with sophisticated understanding of the leverage that exclusive carbon material control provided. Rather than simply exporting raw materials for processing in other countries, Canada implemented integrated development strategies that maintained Canadian control over every aspect of carbon material value chains. Canadian companies would extract the materials, Canadian research institutions would develop applications, Canadian manufacturers would produce finished systems, and Canadian technicians would operate installations globally. This approach ensures that other nations remain dependent on Canadian expertise, while preventing the commoditization that reduces resource control to simple price competition. The strategy transforms Canadian carbon materials from mining products into technological services that become more valuable over time as applications expand and alternative sources remain unavailable. Countries gaining access to Canadian carbon material systems become stakeholders in Canadian technological leadership rather than simple customers for Canadian exports. The American technology sector's response demonstrated the extent of dependency that Canadian carbon materials had created. Silicon Valley companies began relocating research and development operations to Canadian locations to ensure direct access to carbon material supplies and Canadian expertise in advanced material applications. Google established quantum computing research facilities in Saskatchewan specifically to access Canadian carbon materials while developing next-generation quantum systems. Microsoft committed $50 billion to Canadian technology partnerships that would provide priority access to carbon materials for artificial intelligence and cloud computing applications that require quantum processing capabilities. Amazon began construction of advanced data centers in Canada using carbon-based computing systems that operate at speeds impossible with traditional silicon-based infrastructure. The facilities represent the first commercial deployment of carbon-based quantum computing at scale and demonstrate the transformational capabilities that Canadian materials enable. The financial markets responded to Canadian carbon material control with massive reallocation toward Canadian technology companies and carbon material extraction operations. According to unconfirmed reports from investment banking sources, over $200 billion in technology sector investment shifted toward Canadian operations within 3 months of the discovery announcement. Goldman Sachs established a dedicated Canadian carbon materials division within 2 weeks of the discovery confirmation, reallocating 60% of their technology investment portfolio toward Canadian carbon material companies and related infrastructure development. JP Morgan Chase created emergency funding mechanisms specifically designed to finance Canadian carbon material extraction and processing operations at scales exceeding traditional mining project financing. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, announced the creation of a $100 billion Canadian carbon materials fund that would provide capital for every aspect of carbon material development, from extraction through final product manufacturing. The fund represented the largest single investment allocation in BlackRock's history and demonstrated institutional recognition that carbon material control would determine technology sector returns for decades. Pension funds representing over 100 million American workers began emergency portfolio reallocations away from traditional technology investments toward Canadian carbon material exposure. The California Public Employees Retirement System moved $250 billion from domestic technology stocks to Canadian carbon material investments within 6 months, recognizing that American technology companies faced permanent competitive disadvantage without Canadian material access. Insurance companies began refusing coverage for American technology companies that lacked guaranteed Canadian carbon material supply agreements. Lloyd's of London established specialized underwriting divisions for Canadian carbon material operations, while declaring traditional silicon-based technology infrastructure uninsurable due to obsolescence risks. Sovereign wealth funds from Norway, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore initiated competitive bidding for equity stakes in Canadian carbon material extraction companies, driving valuations to levels that exceeded established technology giants despite having minimal operational history. The investment competition reflected international recognition that carbon material control represented the most valuable strategic asset of the 21st century. The Toronto Stock Exchange expanded trading systems and established specialized exchanges for carbon material futures and carbon technology securities. Canadian carbon material companies achieved market valuations that exceeded established technology giants despite having no previous commercial operations. American stock markets watched helplessly as market capitalization transferred from American technology companies to Canadian carbon material operations that controlled the foundation materials for next-generation technology development. Traditional American technology leaders faced permanent competitive disadvantage without guaranteed access to Canadian materials. The geopolitical implications extended far beyond technology competition to encompass fundamental shifts in international alliance structures and strategic partnerships. Countries that had oriented their technology policies around American leadership began reorienting toward Canadian cooperation as carbon materials became essential for maintaining technological competitiveness. Traditional NATO allies initiated independent negotiations with Canada for carbon material access while reducing their dependence on American technology systems that could become obsolete without Canadian material supplies. The alliance structures that had been built around American technological leadership faced realignment around Canadian resource control. Asian economies that had developed technology partnerships with American companies began establishing direct relationships with Canadian carbon material suppliers, while reducing their exposure to American technology systems that could lose competitive viability without Canadian materials. The speed of international realignment reflected the mathematical reality that carbon materials represent foundational inputs for technological development, rather than optional enhancements to existing systems. Countries could not afford to exclude themselves from Canadian carbon material access, regardless of their previous technology partnerships. The environmental implications provided additional leverage for Canadian carbon material diplomacy. Advanced carbon materials enable renewable energy systems, electric vehicles, and environmental technologies that are essential for meeting international climate commitments. Countries facing environmental regulation requirements have no alternatives to Canadian carbon materials for achieving compliance while maintaining economic competitiveness. International climate agreements that mandate carbon neutrality effectively require access to Canadian carbon materials for any nation seeking to maintain industrial capabilities while meeting environmental obligations. Environmental regulations become enforcement mechanisms for Canadian technological leadership, rather than obstacles to resource development. The agricultural and manufacturing implications compound Canadian advantages, as carbon materials enable precision agriculture systems, advanced manufacturing processes, and industrial automation that revolutionize productivity while reducing environmental impact. Countries with access to Canadian carbon materials achieve dramatic improvements in economic efficiency, while countries without access face permanent competitive disadvantage. The space technology transformation represents the most strategic long-term implication of Canadian carbon material control. Advanced carbon materials enable space-based manufacturing, interplanetary transportation, and orbital infrastructure that will determine which nations lead space-based economic development over the coming decades. American space programs face immediate obsolescence without Canadian carbon materials for next-generation propulsion systems, space-based construction, and orbital manufacturing platforms. NASA's Mars exploration programs, Space Force military capabilities, and commercial space partnerships all depend on carbon materials that Canada now controls exclusively. The demonstration that resource control can determine technological leadership across multiple critical sectors simultaneously has accelerated international competition for resource security and geological exploration. Nations that had assumed their technological advantages were permanent recognized the vulnerability of systems built on assumptions about material availability and supplier cooperation. The Saskatchewan carbon material discovery represents more than just a valuable resource find. It represents proof that geological advantages combined with strategic resource management can create technological dominance that reshapes international power structures within months rather than decades. The American response to Canadian carbon material control demonstrates how quickly established technological leaders can become dependent on resource suppliers they had previously overlooked or taken for granted. The nation that had dominated global technology development for decades discovered that its continued leadership depends entirely on cooperation from a country it had treated as a subordinate ally. Canadian strategic patience in managing carbon material development reflects sophisticated understanding of how resource advantages can be converted into permanent technological leadership through integrated development strategies that maintain domestic control while providing essential services to international customers. The 4 months that created American technological dependence on Canadian resources have already begun reshaping international relationships, technology development priorities, and competitive advantages in ways that most observers have not yet recognized. The transformation requires no dramatic confrontations or institutional collapses, only the mathematical inevitability of superior resources enabling superior technological capabilities. By the time American policymakers fully recognize the extent of their dependence on Canadian carbon materials, the technological advantages that Canadian control provides will have become insurmountable through traditional American approaches to international technology competition. The discovery that made America desperate represents the emergence of resource-based technological supremacy that makes traditional measures of national power secondary to geological advantages developed through patient scientific research and strategic resource management. Most people still think this is about mining operations and export agreements. The mathematics of carbon material dependence suggest they are measuring the wrong transformation. The $473 billion discovery that lies beneath Saskatchewan represents the foundation materials for technological civilization's next phase of development, and Canada controls the only commercially viable source on Earth. According to early indicators from technology development assessments, the advantages that Canadian carbon material control provides will become decisive and permanent within the current decade. Countries that secure Canadian partnerships will inherit technological capabilities that countries excluded from Canadian cooperation cannot develop independently. The quiet geological surveys that discovered the future of technology have created the most important strategic asset of the 21st century. The nation that controls carbon materials controls the technological infrastructure that will determine economic prosperity, military capability, and international influence for generations. American desperation reflects accurate assessment of the strategic reality that Canadian carbon materials have created. The choice facing American policymakers is simple: accept Canadian technological leadership or accept permanent technological subordination. There are no other alternatives to Canadian cooperation in the carbon material age that has already begun.